Sometimes you go down a bit of a rabbit hole looking at something online, and before you know it, your entire feed is filled with stuff relating to that topic. And maybe that's what happened to me with the Nintendo DS, and that's why I'm seeing the DS so frequently. But I don't feel like I searched this out. The nostalgia and the rising popularity, once again, around the DS as people kind of look back on it fondly, seems to be all over my YouTube feed and other social medias as well. And it makes sense, because the DS, which came out, in the mid-2000s, is now old enough that the people who grew up with it are going to be nostalgic for it and want to take a look back at it. Now, fortunately, I will preface this by saying oftentimes nostalgia leads to an increase in the price of the product as people try and get back those things from their childhood. And while there are plenty of expensive DS games, I will say at least the hardware, because it sold so many millions of units, is still very inexpensive. You can buy a DS Lite for like $40, $50 on eBay. Might have, some physical damage to it, scuffs and whatnot on the outside. You got to remember, when you were a kid, you treated the thing probably pretty poorly, but they are very durable machines. So with that said, it's still pretty affordable to pick one of these up if you're interested. It's very easy to mod the system, making playing backup games and even Game Boy Advance games and things like that very easy with just an SD card and some simple files. It's an easy system to mod, and because of that, I think it's very accessible to play any of these titles that you remember fondly from your childhood. So I think within the next year or two, we're going to see a wave of nostalgia hit the DS. It's going to become something that people want to play again. They want to revisit because they remember it as a kid being very exciting, because the DS had like a 7-8 year run where it was the handheld. And I think that its lifespan went even farther beyond that, just because, again, they were so popular. I mean, there were so many kids that you probably knew growing up that owned a DS, some DS games, but they didn't even own a home console, or maybe their home console was the Wii, which the Wii is an interesting side note here in the fact that the Wii came out, a couple years later, or a year later or so. I don't think the Wii will have the same sort of nostalgic pull that any of these other consoles had. The original Xbox, the PlayStation 2, for sure the GameCube, and now maybe we're going to see it with the Nintendo DS. People didn't really grow up with the Wii and want to revisit it. I feel like it's something of a novelty in the fact that its technology is very dated by today's standards. There was a lot of shovelware games, and for that reason, I don't think the Wii is going to see the same resurgence that something like the GameCube, for instance, did in just a matter more of years before that Wii demographic kind of catches up to having that disposable income. But the DS is right there in the middle between the GameCube and the Wii in terms of release, and for that reason, I think it's going to hit that nostalgia wave in the next year or two. Now, I grew up a little bit earlier than this. I grew up with the GBA, and there are plenty of GBA games that I would go back and revisit, and there's plenty that feel very dated to me, or they were licensed cash-in titles that I would never take another look at again. But I think the DS has an even more expansive library of games that are worth revisiting. The technology here, despite being nearly 2 decades old, doesn't really feel that archaic. You have some early 3D handheld graphics, things like Metroid Prime look really good on this, actually. But a lot of the games, it's a little bit more of a blocky look to the 3D. Something better than you would have on the Nintendo 64, for instance. In fact, there's a remake of Mario 64 on this thing. But it's not quite, as good as, say, a 3DS, or definitely not like a PS Vita or even a phone game by today's standards. So the 3D is a little bit dated, but not in a way that really hampers the thing from feeling too archaic. Add in the fact that the touchscreen, unlike the Wii motion control remote, does not feel like a gimmick of its time. We still use touchscreens every day, and that way the DS was actually ahead of its time in having a touchscreen and making the system feel a bit newer than it actually is if you don't take into account the release date. And the DS as a solid, and I'm talking solid, portable handheld in terms of its build quality, is something that I really think the market wants to see. Gamers want to see another device be released like this, and we just haven't seen one. Yes, the Nintendo Switch, the Steam Deck, they're portable, but they're not like portable in the fact that you would put that thing in your pocket. It just feels too expensive, too potentially breakable, and the DS never felt that way. That clamshell design, the overall sturdiness of it, it felt like you could reliably throw that thing in your pocket, bring it with you, and not have to worry about it being broken. Whereas if it's a Switch, you got to have it in a case. It's bigger than a DS. It just doesn't quite feel right to bring truly anywhere in the same way the DS did. And I think that the market is yearning for a truly portable handheld as handhelds continue to kind of rise in popularity. You see Ambernick and some of these other brands kind of making these retro handhelds that play the older games. I don't think we'll ever see, a full-on another DS or a dedicated handheld that is strictly for handheld purposes. But if we could get something with a smaller form factor, be it a Switch that folded, I don't think we'll ever see that, but something that played another library of games that already exists, because I don't think you can get developers to commit to making titles for a dedicated handheld anymore. So I think it's very unlikely that a manufacturer would commit to making anything more than a device that plays games from consoles that already had their libraries well and gone, like the GBA, which is what many of these devices are relying on. They're not having any sort of new games coming to the platform, and while I think there will always be homebrewed, ROM hacks of older GBA games, DS games, whatnot coming out that kind of add a new spin on some existing titles and give you some fresh content that way, I would love to see a handheld that actually had its own, dedicated group of games coming out for it, just like the Nintendo Switch does, but with a smaller form factor. And maybe that's just a more durable, smaller form factor Nintendo Switch, but for me, the Switch Lite just isn't quite small enough, or the fact that it doesn't fold and protect the screen isn't ideal for me. So with this gap in the handheld market and just the nostalgia wave that I think is going to hit the DS in the coming years as people kind of look back on their childhood fondly and remember what fun they had with that thing, I think we're going to see the DS kind of have a little bit of a resurgence. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.